I don't, but Caitlin does.
My name's just
Okay.
Ooh, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. If you don't have a stapler, our department secretary has a stapler and is very willing to share. Okay, gang. If you found that this case study was complicated and difficult, that's because it was. So if you had trouble with it, just be assured that your colleagues did too. This was meant to have you think about things that are fairly complicated. So digging into the literature, what you discovered, there's some things that are pretty well established or pretty good evidence for any interventions. There are others. The interventions are not that well established. For example, treating with glucocorticoids after a brain injury. How many found evidence for efficacy of treating with glucocorticoids? How many of you found evidence that you shouldn't do that? Used to be people got brain injuries and treated with glucocorticoids. Now, several fairly well-run studies have shown it doesn't do anything except suppress the patient's immune system. So, you do it? No, you don't do it. You do things for which you have good evidence that work. Sometimes you have a party line. That party line sometimes is wrong. Back in the 70s, 60s, 70s, when a person had a heart attack, they were treated with antiarrhythmics. Everybody did that. That was best practice. Today we know that is dangerous. That's actually a dangerous thing to do. That's not done anymore. So sometimes party lines are wrong. And there's this phrase that was used by Rochelle Walensky, our head of CDC, when she testified before Congress, equipoise. You guys ever heard that term, equipoise? Equipoise means that you guys believe A, and you guys believe B, and we argue about it. There's evidence for A, there's evidence for B, and you guys try to argue with each other and figure out. If there's equipoise, she said, then we run the trials. She was asked the question, why didn't you do any randomized controlled trials about masking in schools? You funded this many studies about masking in schools, Yet you demanded, and that's in school, she said, we didn't have equipoise on the issue. Everyone believed masks worked, which the epidemiologist went, really? Nobody asked us. So that's why they did 0 studies, she said, because we didn't have equipoise. You should have run those studies, Michelle. You really should have run those studies. Because most epidemiologists didn't believe there was good evidence for masking toddlers. It turns out masking toddlers was dumb. Masking kids in school was dumb. It's still dumb. But still parts of the country, places in New York, 2 to 4-year-olds going to daycare have to wear masks. I'm sorry, that's dumb. There's some health policies that are dumb. There's no evidence for it. They're annoying, and they prevent kids from acquiring language. They can prevent kids from being able to read faces. They prevent kids from being able to relate to each other in different ways. We have evidence for that. You know where that evidence comes from? World War II. It's what kids had to do when they went down into the tunnels in England. They had to put on gas masks because of dangers of gas attacks. And so you had all these kids who were used to watching their peers in gas masks and communicating with each other in gas masks. And you get kids now with all kinds of fetishes and things like that. We got evidence for it, but no, we still make kids wear masks. Okay, I'll make it all better. And we'll talk about that all period if I keep on this. So you need to practice evidence-based medicine, and that's something that's what this assignment was an attempt to do, to get you to see. Sometimes there's standard practice, but the evidence for it is not so good. And then we have better evidence, and then we hopefully change our practice. You'll be willing to have an open mind about evidence. If you're willing to change your mind about things, that's all part of being a medical practitioner, because studies will provide different mountains of evidence for things, and they'll have to change practice. And that's okay. You want to give patients the best care, right? That best care, get that best care, you need evidence. And that's why you depend on studies. Very good. So we're talking about what happens with the brain. Remember that alertness and consciousness is very dependent on this structure of the brain called the reticular activating system. The reticular activating system. The RAS, does that ring any bells from last semester, anybody? It does. Dawn is nodding her head. If I gave this to you, could you show me where it is, Dawn? You don't think so? Anybody want to take a shot at where the RAS is located? That doesn't mean Royal Air Services, that's the activating system. Is it here? Is it here? Is it here? Where is it? Okay. Go ahead, point. Very close, right up, right there. Okay, so dorsal brainstem extends from the midbrain through the pons, through the medulla. Series of neurons. A good portion of those neurons are noradrenergic. If they're noradrenergic, what neurotransmitter do they use? Noradrenaline is what's the new term for adrenaline? Epinephrine. So they use epinephrine. So these are largely noradrenaline neurons. They make a kind of a stripe down the back, dorsal part, brainstem. If that gets disrupted, you will have trouble with consciousness. General anesthesia suppresses this. So does sleep. Part of the sleep circuitry in your brain is to turn that off so you go to sleep. If this gets damaged or rendered inoperative even acutely, you will lose consciousness. So let's talk about ways that you might lose consciousness. Oh, I keep a piece of my mind. Now, let's think about this. Okay, let's say Jade becomes a protege of Mitch Ziegler and she takes up kickboxing. Okay, so Jade, let's say you get a rather mean right cross developed under Mitch's great tutelage, of course. Okay, so give me a nice right cross right there. That's better. Okay. Thank you, much better. Now, a blow to say the front of the face, that's going to cause trauma. This is what we call coup, and it's C-O-U-P-E, coup trauma. So it seems like a little bit of French going on there, and you'd be right, because most of the people who describe this were French neuroanatomists. Now, if Jade provides a nice, powerful right cross and damages coup, that's going to propel the head back, and the brain is going, because the brain, remember, is suspended inside your head. The back of it is now going to hit the back of the head. That will cause a rebound set of damage on the back, and that is called contre coup. Contre coup. So if you talk about primary and secondary brain damage, the coup is primary. The contre coup is secondary, because that's not directly from the blow, that is a secondary effect of the blow. Now, let's say Mitch starts working with Jade, and Jade develops her left hook. There's the left hook. Okay. Now when you left, oh, okay, look, left hook comes this way, so now that's going to take the head and the neck and it's going to twist it. Those are called torsional forces. Torsional forces, and one of the things it can twist is that reticular formation. So you twist that reticular formation, you can stretch those axons in there. You stretch those axons, you can essentially, acutely at least, damage them, and you can lose consciousness. That's why with a proper blow to the head, you can actually lose consciousness, like if you got one of Dave's very famous left hooks. That. Now, let's consider what happens to the brain on a cellular level after you get a rather robust left hook. Now, I'm going to try to do this with colored chalk, so don't make fun of me. Back to my childhood, sidewalk chalk. Okay. We need color, so I'm going to use sidewalk chalk. So let's pretend that's a neuron. It's ugly, I know, but humor me. So this is the axon terminus. That's the axon. Here's the axon hillock. These are meant to be dendrites, at least. If you stretch the axon, you're going to compromise little sections of the membrane. When you compromise those little sections of the membrane, the cell will start to leak potassium. Calcium, which is very low inside the cell, relatively high outside the cell, will now come in. When this occurs, this cell now becomes hyperactivated. So you get neurons now that all start to all of a sudden activate in general. Now, something else happens after a head injury. The reason for this is not terribly well understood. After a head injury, blood flow to the brain diminishes. That's largely due to vasoconstriction. Now, I hope you see the problem. The neurons are hyperactivating. They need more energy because they're working harder, but their energy supply is decreased. Do you see a problem for the neurons? Decreased supply, increased demand. This is the cellular basis of concussions. The brain consumes more oxygen, needs more glucose, but has reduced delivery of oxygen and glucose and so on and so forth. Without proper glucose delivery to the brain, this very active neuron, one of the things it uses glucose for, of course, is to make ATP. ATP is used for the sodium potassium ATPase. The sodium potassium ATPase cannot properly function. That means the ionic interior of the cell cannot be properly maintained. The neuron now is going to start to swell. If the neuron starts to swell, if neurons in general start to swell, that's going to increase intracranial pressure as well. And your blood flow is reduced. Because your blood flow is reduced, you can't remove toxins and other things from the brain as well. So all of this is a consequence of head trauma. This is a basic mismatch you have between demand and supply. The supply goes down, the demand goes up. And this is one of the reasons why after a head trauma, one of the first things you have the patient do is they must rest. They must rest. Because if they don't rest, you see the issues here? The patient doesn't rest. Patient continues to use their brain. When you have this decreased blood supply to it, and it's already has increased demands, you're going to further potentially damage the brain. So this can be the result of any sort of torque injury, rotational forces. It can be the result of coup, a contre coup, or all the above can essentially cause this type of brain pathology. And if you affect the reticular system, you will lose consciousness as well. That will be another added feature. So who's at risk for this? Of course, anybody involved in a contact sport. Soldiers,
combat-related injuries, cycling injuries, and consider who else might have head injuries. How about alcoholics? Do they walk funny? Are they at greater risk for falls? How about elderly folks who have ataxia of some sort or something? They at risk for falls? Yeah, some of you may end up working with some of those folks. Many institutions have the falling belt in many places it's white. Doesn't have to be white. I've seen belts that are not white, but the ones they use over here and the ones they use in the PT clinic are white. So white belt. That you see the white belt means they're falling risk, and the therapist or the medical director will have a hold of that belt, and they feel the patient starting to go, they put them in so they don't fall. Certain medications can increase falling risk as well. So you want to avoid this if at all possible, but should someone whack their head, they need to be observed. So what kind of complications can this sort of thing cause? Increased brain activity can cause seizures. That's one of the complications is seizures. If you have a second head trauma after the initial head trauma, then you have so-called second impact syndrome. The pathology of second impact syndrome is not completely understood, but the second impact seems to reduce blood flow to the brain even more and seems to increase edema in the brain even more. And that's why a second blow to the head after an initial blow to the head that doesn't fully heal can be potentially fatal. So we just went through a pro football season where the Miami Dolphins quarterback, who attended Beloa, had, I remember watching that Thursday night game where he was doing this dispensing response, scary. And then they wanted to put him in, and then before that, he had that incident where he got up, started to walk back to the huddle, and then just collapsed. That is kind of classic concussion behavior, typically. And again, he's a pro athlete. He wants to go back in. The independent neurologist should have said, not in your life, pal. And then he went back in, he got hurt again, and then that neurologist got fired, as well he should have been. Now, repeated concussions can tend to cause this phenomenon called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE. And in this case, what seems to happen is that the debris produced by repeated brain damage tends to accumulate and forms neurofibrillary tangles and amyloid plaques and things like that that kind of sort of look like what you see in Alzheimer's brain. And something that seems to be significant is the length of time between brain damage. You have brain damage and it's close together. That seems to increase your risk for CTE. So let's talk a bit about the signs and symptoms, say, of a concussion. Some of you who play sports may have known someone who experiences this, or maybe you experienced it yourself.
These can develop days after the injury. They may continue soon after. So you may get things like dizziness, headache. With damage to the brain, acute damage to the brain, nausea and vomiting are pretty common. Athletes typically don't eat very much before a competition, so nausea and vomiting may not happen on the field because they don't have anything in their stomach. Light and sound sensitivity, that's actually pretty common. Tinnitus, ringing in the ears, may also be pretty common. Tinnitus, or as the British say, tinnitus. There might be some incoordination or muscle weakness, and you also might have some palsies of the nerves of the face. When you guys learn how to do head to toe exams, you'll learn about cranial nerves, and that's one of the first things you should do to someone who is a concussion candidate. Now, do you have to lose consciousness for it to be a concussion? Aaron's shaking his head. Aaron's absolutely right. You don't have to. So a concussion, another term for a concussion is mild brain trauma with or without loss of consciousness. You can see why it's called concussion, because that's much shorter than mild brain trauma with or without loss of consciousness. It's too many words. Concussion is much shorter. So people mentally may have things like a mental fog. They may have trouble focusing. And they might even have some memory loss. Now, the Glasgow scale I gave you last time. If a patient has a Glasgow score after concussion below 15, they need to go to the hospital. No complaints. You get them to the hospital. Oh, I want to keep playing. That's a good one. No, hospital. And patients with bad concussions should be observed for 24 hours. If you do a CT scan, head CT of a concussion patient, are you going to see anything? You often don't. You often don't. Someone has a bleed or something like that, yeah, we'll see that. But concussions, CT scans usually don't tell you a thing. The CT scan is preemptive. In case they have a bleed or something like that, you're trying to rule it out. So a CT scan will tell you nothing, but that doesn't mean that there was not acute damage to the brain. So imaging rules things out, but it's not very useful. So those of you who have played in sports, there are standard concussion protocols on the sideline. So you guys are soccer players or basketball? One of the trainers is usually on the sideline. You guys are playing, right? So it's either David or Chris or somebody else. They are trained in concussion protocol. You go up for a ball and somebody gives you a forehead right there, and you go down, and all of a sudden there's two of everything. David's going to essentially come right up and he's going to start the concussion protocol. You can say, okay, Kylie, who am I? Kylie, what's your name? Oh, wait, what day is it? Blah, blah, blah. Squeeze my finger. Can you move this, can you shrug your shoulders? Can you not move?
head to toe sort of thing, and then if you can get up, you'll get up and walk off, but you won't play the rest of the game. And the coach might even say, forget practice the next day, you need to rest and stuff like that, so. There are protocols, some of you may end up doing sports nursing. Fascinating field of medicine, by the way. You'll do concussion protocols, if you do emergency medicine, you'll be training concussion protocols, and, these are very standardized. Headaches, which are common, should be treated with things like acetaminophen. You should stay away from narcotics. Anybody know why? What do narcotics do to your mental focus? Do they sharpen it or deaden it? They deaden it, and your mental focus is already poor. So if you give narcotics and their focus is already poor, you're going to make the focus worse. So stay away from narcotics, because you want to have a clear picture of their mental processes. The narcotics will obscure that. So stay away from narcotics. Now, when we talk about alterations or injuries to the brain, there are two terms you need to be aware of. So the first of these is supratentorial. Supratentorial means everything above that tentorium, those folds in the meninges that separate the cerebrum from the cerebellum. So anything essentially up here is supratentorial. So Jade's left hook, for example, or Maria's right cross, those are injuries here. Those are supratentorial. Any injury or tumor or anything like that below this area that affects the midbrain, the brainstem, the cerebellum, that's infratentorial. Supratentorial, infratentorial. So Grace, there's a lesion to the midbrain. That's supratentorial or infratentorial. Infra, very good. Infra. Haley, if there is a lesion on the temporal lobe, is that supratentorial or infratentorial? Supra, right, supra. The temporal lobe is part of the cerebral cortex. Very good. John, if there's a lesion to the cerebellum, is that supratentorial or infratentorial? Infratentorial, very good, very good. Metabolic, yes. What would the thalamus would be supratentorial. Supratentorial. If you have, and this is usually the case with either diabetes or with liver malfunction. With liver malfunction, if you have high levels of ammonium in the blood, ammonium interferes with neurotransmitter biochemistry. Because it interferes with neurotransmitter biochemistry, you will now have a metabolic problem with the brain. So it's not a structural insult to the brain, it's metabolic. Or in the case of uncontrolled diabetic ketoacidosis, the brain's not getting enough sugar if the blood sugar levels would say are too low. And the blood becomes acidic, and that can interfere with brain function as well. So that would be metabolic. Metabolic. There are also inherited errors of metabolism that can interfere with brain function. So phenylketonuria, for example, phenylketonuria is due to an inability to break down the amino acid phenylalanine. Phenylalanine builds up in the blood, it crosses the blood-brain barrier, it interferes with
neurotransmitter biochemistry. There's another genetic disease called porphyria, where you don't break down heme properly because you don't, excuse me, you can't make heme properly because you can't make heme. The intermediates to heme synthesis cross the blood-brain barrier and interfere with brain function. There's an old movie now, The Madness of King George, played by Neville Chamberlain. Masterful performance. Way before you guys were born. Well, not way before you guys were born, but far enough for you. Where he suffered, it's thought, from a form of porphyria, and that form of porphyria caused him to have fits of sleeplessness and very odd behavior. And that would be another example of metabolic. So that could be due to genetic errors of metabolism. And then you can have problems that are psychogenic. Psychogenic can be either the result of trauma, so post-traumatic stress, not called disorder anymore, post-traumatic stress syndrome. People with severe post-traumatic stress syndrome can have problems with arousal. As can people with various types of other, either psychiatric or psychological sorts of conditions. So if you have trouble with proper arousal, if there are any sorts of damage to, say, the brainstem, the respiratory and cardiac centers in the brainstem, if those are damaged, then there's this alternation in breathing pattern. So Cheyne-Stokes respirations, if they occur when you're awake, they usually occur if they occur during sleep. You have a period of very fast and shallow breathing, followed by slow, heavier breathing, and then moments without any breathing at all, apnea. So essentially don't breathe and then you try to catch up. So if no breathing or very shallow breathing and then very heavy breathing and then no breathing, then very heavy breathing and then no breathing, very heavy breathing. Or post hyperventilation apnea, where you hyperventilate and then you hardly breathe at all, and then you hyperventilate or hardly breathe at all. These are usually indicative of damage to the brainstem of some sort. Damage to the oculomotor nerves. Those nuclei are in the brainstem, and you can get a so-called blown pupil, where you shine the light in the eyes and the pupils do not constrict. Damage to other cranial nerves can cause a variety of different problems with eye movements. So if you have someone say, follow your finger, they may not be able to properly follow your finger, for example, if they have damage to the abducens nerve. The abducens is necessary for abduction. We can't abduct and have damage to the oculomotor nerve. And then various motor responses. For example, with damage to the cerebellum, there's a test you can give to someone where you have them, go ahead, just you're writing it down, here. Just touch my finger, go out, touch my finger, now touch your nose. Okay, touch my finger, touch your nose, now touch my finger, because I'm too far away on this. Okay, touch your nose, touch your nose, okay, now touch my finger, touch your nose. Okay, you're good. Now, if someone has damage to the cerebellum, they will do things like point past it, or then they get the first one and then the other one.
kids have trouble with that. That's a really easy test you can do. Just the finger and you just move the finger. The other test you have them do is the cerebellum is very important for repetitive movement. You just have them do this. That's a very easy test. People with cerebellar damage have trouble doing that. That's called dysdidecoplegia. A long word. But that is indicative of damage to the cerebellum. And these are all motor responses that are indicative of damage to the cerebellum. And then the gait as well. The gait will tend to be altered. And the gait, they'll usually have a staggering gait towards the side of the damage of the cerebellum. Almost like a drunken person's gait.
Vomiting, yawning, hiccups, this is all part and parcel of not being able to properly control CO2 levels in the blood. So a patient has structural problems with the brain tissue, and that will cause a decreased level of consciousness. Which of the following terms would best describe the location of this lesion? Subdural, infratentorial, intracerebral, or extracerebral? Which do you think is the best answer there? B? Who thinks B is the best answer there? Anybody else? Now let's change that. Let's say they have a problem with say arousal. Instead of level of consciousness, it's level of arousal. Now which answer do you pick? A, B, C, or D? Who thinks A is the right answer? Who thinks B is the right answer? Who thinks C is the right answer? Who thinks D is the right answer? Who didn't answer because you're really lost? So for level of consciousness, you typically would think of the reticular activating system, and that is infratentorial. If you're talking about arousal, they're already conscious. And you're trying to get them to do something with that consciousness. In this case, it's going to probably be intracerebral in that case. Let's talk about brain death. In this case, the brain can no longer regulate the body very well. So you have a complete absence of reflexes, complete absence of motor and of motor responses. You don't have any spontaneous breathing. The patient has to be put on a respirator in order to breathe. You don't have any pupillary response. EEG is flat. And this is persistent for 6 to 12 hours. If the brainstem is intact, then the patient will usually be able to breathe and the heart will beat on its own. If in fact you have this sort of state like this, there is a, it used to be called persistent vegetative state, but it's not called that anymore, where the brain is fully active, but the brain essentially cannot communicate with the rest of the body. There's a syndrome called locked-in syndrome. That is usually due to strokes within the brainstem, will cause locked-in syndrome. So with cerebral death, the brainstem is still active. You have death essentially of parts, most or all of the cerebral hemispheres. And that is exclusive. You still have the cerebellum, still have the brainstem. So you don't get environmental or behavioral responses, but the brain continues to maintain internal homeostasis. That's cerebral death. And these folks will be in a minimally conscious state. Locked-in syndrome is one of those. Other conditions may cause selective attention. This is fairly common after certain types of strokes. There's something called neglect syndrome. Have any of you heard of neglect syndrome? It tends to be due to damage to the parietal lobe, where someone, for example, if you have damage to one side of the parietal lobe, you may have hemi-neglect syndrome. Someone will literally shave one side of their face and they won't shave the other side of their face. They don't recognize that side of them as being part of them. That's called neglect syndrome. That's a type of alteration in awareness. People may have an inability to distinguish certain external stimuli as well. You can also have damage to memory. So that memory can be preceding memory, retrograde memory, anterograde memory. They may have trouble forming new memories, or they may have trouble processing images, and they might not be able to say, like faces, they may not be able to recognize faces anymore, or something like that. So it's clear that memories are stored really throughout the brain. And there are different types of memories. There are declarative memories, like you're learning things that hopefully will become declarative memories. Then there are other types of memories that are more muscle memory, that sort of thing. Think, for example, if I were to ask you, when you get out of the shower, what's the first part of your body you dry? When I ask you that question, what do? In your head, you kind of rewind getting out of the shower. You just don't know it on top of your head. You have to kind of do it. Okay, just go ahead and give me an answer really fast. What's the first part of your body you dry when you get out of the shower? Yeah, hair, face, usually you need to go from top to bottom. That's a muscle memory thing. You just do it. You don't sit there and have a list. Okay, hair first. All right, then look at your nose, then the ears. Okay, neck, right up. This is back up. No, you just do it. It's a muscle memory thing. And if I ask you, when you put your trousers on, which leg do you put in first? Most of you will probably sit there and go, oh, right leg. You don't sit there and say, oh, that's the right leg. No, you have to kind of do it. Those are muscle memory things. And your cerebellum plays a really important role in that type of muscle memory. So, Kylie, shooting basketball. You don't sit there and go through, okay, one, okay, look at the basket, two, no. That's all part that your cerebellum actually helps you learn in conjunction with your motor cortex, actually. So these are other types of memories as well. And you can lose certain types of declarative memories while still maintaining muscle memory for that reason. Now, anterograde amnesia is usually due to damage to the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe will tend to store short-term memories and then convert them into long-term memories. If you have damage to the temporal lobe, you can then have trouble taking short-term memories, converting them into long-term. And there's been some very, very good work on patients with damage to the temporal lobe. Usually the temporal lobe had to be removed because of intractable epilepsy, who have this trouble with anterograde amnesia. You come into a room, you can talk to them. In fact, you can talk to them for hours. They'll tell you lots and lots and lots about their previous life or something like that. You leave the room, you come back maybe 5 minutes later, and they don't remember who you are. You have to reintroduce yourself. They don't remember anything about you. And that is due to problems integrating those short-term memories into long-term memories. Executive attention deficits like ADHD, that pretty much maps to the frontal cortex. So the frontal cortex and noradrenergic and dopaminergic signaling in the frontal cortex is responsible for focus. And drugs that are used to treat ADHD, this is what they attempt to do. They attempt to extend, augment noradrenergic neurotransmission in the frontal cortex. That's a reason why folks with ADHD will self-medicate sometimes with caffeine. Maybe you know anyone with ADHD who does that? I do. My oldest daughter has ADHD. And that's why she has to make sure she gets a good stiff cup of coffee in the morning to be able to properly function. Now, she's a sushi chef. You gotta focus pretty well. You're gonna cut that fish really, really thinly. So she can obviously focus. She's learned to. She's learned to self-medicate with coffee and then just learn to kind of say, no, I'll do that. Here's how she described it to me. When she was in school, teacher was explaining something, and the teacher's watch was so much more interesting than what the teacher was explaining. Now, some of you may hear that and say, well, gee, that kind of sounds like me. No, you can control it. Someone ADHD, no, that watch, ooh, what kind of watch is that? You know, I saw a watch like that on TV the other day. Wonder why that watch was made. And what sort of things that watch can do. And you missed it, even the teacher had said. And so she had to take Ritalin, then we transferred her to Adderall, and the Adderall was better for her. So, there's a quizzer at Hillsdale who has ADHD, nicest kid you'll ever meet. Sweetheart of a kid, but he's not on his medication. Josiah, you need to sit down. Josiah, can I actually, Josiah, please? Josiah, time for the next question. Josiah, hello? Eyes, hello, Josiah? Yes. So that's an example. That's executive issues.
So I think caffeine, like, how does that?
Caffeine is a sympathomagnetic. Because this is sympathomagnetic, meaning it acts like something that activates the sympathetic nervous system. It will augment noradrenergic signaling in the forebrain. That's why, are you coffee drinking? No. Oh, tea. Okay, you drink tea already. Or, yeah, me too. I can't say coffee. I do coffee. Having said that, my kids love it. Oh, I don't know that. Coffee's my life. My kids all love coffee. My wife loves coffee. She can't drink it. That's why it's a good thing. So it acts kind of like that, but caffeine is a short half-life. So it's like a kick to kind of get you into that zone where you can do stuff and be alert and focus. And you can do this sushi without putting your hand out. So that's like caffeine. And she will drink another cup. She takes a thermos with her. She'll take another hit around noon. And her coffee with lunch, and then her coffee at 3 and sleep like a baby at night. That's essentially how she gets through the day. She self-medicates with coffee and chocolate. She's majorly chocoholic. So she got from Dad for Valentine's Day lots of chocolate because she needs it. She needs it. The sugar helps her too. I tried when she was a kid, we tried sugar-free chocolate, see if that would kind of take the edge off the hyperactivity. She wouldn't eat the sugar-free chocolate. She said, this is disgusting. So we had to give her the good stuff. So if you guys go to Aka, you might see Rachel on the line doing sushi. So, all right. So how are we doing here? Oh, we got time. Now, strokes can shut off blood supply to the brain. You shut off blood supply, the brain can't get oxygen for ATP synthesis. The cells will start to swell, and without oxygen and glucose, those cells will start to die off. When neurons die, they dump neurotransmitters into the environment, and all those neurotransmitters hyperactivate the nearby neurons, and then they're hyperactive, but they don't have very good blood supply. So they die. This is called excitotoxicity. Excitotoxicity. This is the main reason why the actual site of the stroke kills a few neurons, but then you get this penumbra of cells that extend out, and this is due to excitotoxicity. So strokes can damage parts of the brain and affect awareness, can affect consciousness, can affect the ability of the brain to direct parts of the body, can direct the, the ability to feel and stuff like that. So if grandma turns to you and says, I can't really feel. And then you notice her face starts to sag, and then maybe her speech starts to slur. What? Yes, call an ambulance right away, because that's a sign essentially of a stroke. My colleague last semester scared the crud out of me. Turned out it was a migraine. It wasn't a stroke, but I still did the right thing.
He cried more than he used to. Like, what caused him to like be more emotional?
Right. So he had probably the forebrain was essentially controlling his emotional state, the limbic system. That control probably has been abrogated to some extent, and that's probably why he gets more emotion. That's actually not that uncommon. That can happen after a heart attack as well. Heart attacks can actually make you more emotional as well, not just slow. So yeah, in fact, people's personalities sometimes can change after strokes, for better or for worse. So can destruction caused by any sort of compression damage, toxins, metabolic issues, all those sorts of things. So these types of problems with processing. So dysphagia means essentially you can't properly take the right language. You either have trouble understanding it or expressing it. So expressive dysphagia, you know full well what you want to say, but you can't get it out. That's expressive dysphagia. A receptive dysphagia, you can express things, but when someone says something to you, it doesn't quite do it. My nephew has, he's on the spectrum, autism spectrum disorder. He has problems with processing language a little bit. Transcortical essentially is a problem not just with receptive, but you have this speech, it's very fluent, but it's meaningless. So with expressive dysphagia, you'll have the right word, but the right word will be mixed with the wrong words, whereas with transcortical, very fluid speech, but it's gibberish. And then when I say, Kirsten, stand up, you may say, it's windy today or something like that. You hear the wrong thing. Or you may hear nothing. Just nothing makes any sense anymore. The global dysphagia, where neither anything you say nor anything you hear makes any sense. The entire processing part of your brain is offline. Aphasia simply means you get the wrong word for the right thing. And damage to the Broca's area of the brain. The Broca's area is associated with Broca's aphasia, where you just use the wrong word for things. You don't use the wrong word all the time. But instead of saying, I feel great, you might say, I feel morning, or something like that. There's a video online of a chap with Broca's aphasia.